Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in October of 2025. And there were some really good ones and also some really interesting ones that I'm not quite sure how I'm going to talk about. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first book that I picked up is the first half of a duology by V.E. Schwab called Vicious. And I got to the second book later in the month as well. It is called Vengeful. So I'm going to talk about both of these together. They're part of a duology called the Villains duology. And I really like V.E. Schwab. There is very little that I've read by her that I don't enjoy. And so this is a duology about two guys that meet in college, and they both are interested in discovering basically how to turn themselves into superheroes. And they figure out how to do it. And then they become basically like arch nemesis, arch villains against each other. And they go on these different pathways, but they stay kind of interconnected. And I'm not going to go into all the details of like how they figure out how to become superheroes, because it actually has a really kind of core element to this story. But I loved these two books. I thought they were super interesting. I really like the range of this author. She writes everything from like romances to these kind of like sci-fi, fantasy, all different kinds of things. And I just really enjoyed these. So would definitely recommend if that sounds like it's up your alley. Then I picked up something completely different, which is a book called Finding Your Own North Star by Martha Beck. And Martha Beck is a life coach. She actually runs a life coach training program and does a number of different things, including writing books. And she's a very kind of like inspirational coach. Martha Beck is also, I think, kind of known for having like a little bit of like dabbling in the paranormal. And she talks about this in one of her memoirs about her son and how she had kind of these like experiences when she was pregnant with her child. And so this comes into how she talks about coaching, and it has a lot to do with kind of like intuition, or you might call it kind of like woo. And there are elements of what she talks about that I find really interesting. And I think that this is kind of just part of how she views the world. So that was one that I also enjoyed as well. Next, I picked up the latest memoir by Elizabeth Gilbert, and it is called All the Way to the River. And when I mentioned there were some books I wasn't quite sure how to talk about, this is one of them. I think that Elizabeth Gilbert, if you're not familiar with her, is probably best known for her Eat, Pray, Love memoir, which was turned into a film. And then she wrote a second memoir called Committed, which is about the marriage that she had coming out of Eat, Pray, Love, in part because her partner at the time, I think, needed like a visa. And so they were kind of going through this process of trying to bring him into the United States. And this most recent memoir is about another relationship that she had with a woman who was her best friend for many, many years. And when this woman, her name is Rhea, was diagnosed with cancer, and basically terminal cancer, Elizabeth Gilbert and Rhea basically discover that they have been in love with each other. And Elizabeth Gilbert leaves her husband, begins to have a relationship with Rhea, and is with her until she dies of cancer. And in this book, Elizabeth Gilbert talks about a number of different things. One of them is basically her self-awareness. She comes to identify as someone who is an addict to love and sex. She also talks about the addiction of her partner, Rhea, who was an addict before they came to know each other, and then engages in significant drug use during the period of time where she's dying of cancer. And what I would say that I found kind of challenging about this book is I think that Elizabeth Gilbert over time has become very self-aware, of a number of things that she's kind of dealing with. And I think that some people have held up this book as like a very transparent, almost like guru status of Elizabeth Gilbert. And I think that what we're also seeing in this memoir is Elizabeth Gilbert is a relatively troubled person who is being very honest about kind of the things that she is challenged by. And there are a number of like difficult things that she talks about in this memoir, very openly and transparently, that I'm sure other people can identify with and maybe even take kind of some solace from. But there were also things that she talked about that I think, and I've read, kind of some reviews of what people think about this, that people they find very concerning, of how she talks about certain things in this memoir. She also embeds some poetry throughout. She is kind of talking about her life post the death of her partner. And so there's a number of really interesting things here. But I would say that the person who was the Eat, Pray, Love, version of Elizabeth Gilbert is very different than the Elizabeth Gilbert we're seeing in this particular memoir. And there's a clear evolution that she has gone through, over the course of her life. So I would put myself in the camp of the group of people that found some things concerning as I was reading through this, and not just kind of accepting it whole, in terms of, I think some people have really been just praising this as kind of their primary way of responding to the memoir. And there were a lot of questions that this raised for me in terms of just how she's using this narrative of what has happened to her partner. And for example, at the beginning of this memoir, she talks about how she basically got permission from the spirit of her partner to tell this story after she died. I think some people find that, kind of an interesting way of giving herself permission to talk about a lot of things that are very personal, and that are not about herself, when it comes to this story. So as with many memoirs, they can be quite controversial in terms of how people talk about their lives and the people that are in their lives and in relationships with them. And this would be one of those memoirs. So if any of that sounds interesting, you can pick it up and see what you think. Next, I picked up a book called Codename Villanelle, and this is a book that is part of the Killing Eve series. So this was eventually made into a television series, and it is basically about a woman who is a psychopath, who is kind of like a hired killer. And then there's another woman who is part of the police and MI6, and she's an operative, and she's trying to catch this killer. And so this is basically the first book in a, I don't know how long the series is. Let me look really quickly. There's at least 5 books in this series, and that relatively short. This was little over 200 pages, so almost like a novella. And it does make me want to continue to watch the television show, which I had actually started before I read this novella. And I find the relationship kind of between these two women and how it goes back and forth, really interesting. So I'm sure I will continue to watch that. Then I picked up a book called Sandwich by Catherine Newman. I had heard about this book as being kind of a humorous, funny book. And it is. It's basically about this family that is at a vacation home together, and there's kind of parent-child dynamics going back and forth. There's a second book in this series that recently came out, which is how it got on my radar, and I'll probably pick it up just because I thought it was kind of interesting. And I would say in the midst of the humor, some pretty serious family themes in terms of communication and secrets, that people are keeping from each other and things like that. But I enjoyed this one. Then I read a book called If Not For My Baby by Kate Golden. This is the story of a rock star and a backup singer who end up being in a relationship with each other. And while I thought this was well done, and there's a ton of people who really enjoy it, I will also say that sometimes the thing that I find challenging about romances is when I don't really understand why the main characters like each other. And I feel like this was a little bit of an insta-love kind of trope in this particular romance. And I found each of the characters kind of interesting on their own, but when they started to be in a relationship with each other, I didn't really see kind of the connection of what was drawing them together. And so that felt like a little bit of a miss for me. But in terms of the writing style and the plotting and things like that, I thought it was fine. All right, then I picked up a book called Brightside by Kim Holden. And this is a book that has a pretty significant twist that I did not see coming, and so I don't want to talk about it because it could give something away. But it is basically about a girl who's in college, and she has a best friend who's in a band. And then she has this other guy who's traveling in the band, so he's not with her. And then there's this other guy that she meets when she's in college. He's working at a coffee shop, and they begin to have a relationship. And it's a little bit of kind of a triangle, because she has this very deep friendship with this best friend of hers who's in the band. And they had actually kind of slept together before she goes to college, but then decided not to be in a romantic relationship with each other. But there's clearly some feelings there. And then she has this other relationship with this other guy that she's navigating. And something happens. I would say maybe 2/3 of the way through the book, that like shifts the entire dynamic of like what's happening with these relationships. And I wasn't anticipating it, and it actually like, I thought it was going to kind of like wreck the book for me a little bit because I wasn't expecting it, and I thought, oh no, it's going to be like a certain kind of book. And the ending resolved that for me. I thought the ending was very good, and there's actually a couple other books I think in this series, and I am planning to pick them up just to kind of follow along and see what happens with these characters. So there was a area of reading this that I thought, I don't know where this is going to go, but it ended up kind of saving itself in the end. Then I picked up a book called Too Old for This by Samantha Downing. And this is basically a book about an elderly woman who is a serial killer, and she can't stop killing people. And she's kind of like retired basically. And then something happens and someone comes to find her basically and do like a documentary about her. Because she was accused at one point of being a serial killer, and she kind of gets off and doesn't go, to prison and isn't like found guilty of this. But people know of her, and they know that there's kind of this background. And so this person approaches her about doing a documentary, and it kind of like sets off this chain of events where she's kind of like killing people left and right. And I would say that this is a very dark humor kind of book, in that like this character is saying all kinds of things that are just kind of funny in terms of like how she's seeing the world and how she's making decisions. And so I appreciated it from that perspective. It was definitely unique. I feel like I have not read a lot of books that have kind of elderly serial killers in them. And so that was kind of an interesting component to this one. All right, then I picked up a book called The New Science of Momentum: How the Best Coaches and Leaders Build a Fire from a Single Spark. This is by Don Yeager. And I made kind of a silly mistake, honestly, when I picked this book. I was like, oh, this is about coaches. And I'm thinking like, I am a coach, like I'm a credentialed coach, not like a sports coach, which obviously this is about sports coaches. And I should have figured that out. Like I should have realized that that's what this author was talking about, but I assumed the other kind of coach. And basically it's talking about like, for example, if you have a team, a sports team that is in a losing game, how do you like get that to like rally that team and like get them to have, momentum and like come back from that and eventually like win the game? Like what are some things you can do? So there's like sports examples, there's military examples, there's other leadership examples. I found this to be interesting, but I think that because I was expecting something different, it just kind of fell a little bit flat for me, because I don't really resonate with sports examples and military examples. I kind of struggle when that's the base, of one of these books. So if any of that does sound interesting, you might want to pick it up. But this was one that I think I had a different expectation going in, and it kind of ended up like coloring my experience of reading the book. Next, I picked up a book called The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. And this is basically a book about an older woman who writes a bunch of letters to a bunch of different people, and they write back to her. And it was a full cast audio of people kind of writing back and forth with this woman. And you end up finding out kind of there's a storyline throughout of a letter that she's writing, and we don't know who she's writing to. And we're kind of learning about her, and we're learning about her past and her family and things like that as we're going through the book. This was a really lovely kind of literary fiction. I think that there are many different people who've really enjoyed this book. It's relatively recent. It didn't come out all that long ago. And so if that's, a kind of an epistolary novel sounds interesting to you, you might pick that one up. Then I picked up a book called All the Ugly and Wonderful Things by Bryn Greenwood. And this is about a young girl who ends up having a relationship, both like kind of like it's strange. It's like a quasi, this is another book I have a hard time figuring out how to talk about. It's like a quasi like familial relationship that becomes a friendship that eventually becomes like a romance. And she's having this relationship with kind of a biker who's part of like a criminal enterprise that's like part of her family that's like tied in with this situation. And this guy basically comes alongside her when she's actually quite young. They meet when she's like 10 or younger, and he crashes his bike, and she's there, and she kind of helps him like by calling, for an ambulance and things like that. And he becomes kind of protective of her, but they end up having a relationship when she is still quite young. I should say a romantic relationship when she is still quite young. And so I was really interested to read the reviews of like, what did people think of this relationship where he's kind of pursuing her when he is an adult and she is a child. And a lot of people kind of talked about this as more of just like an unconventional romance versus like a person who's like grooming someone else. And I think the general idea of this book is that the male main character does not necessarily, he's not attracted to children, he's attracted to this individual person. And he happens to begin that attraction when she is quite young. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that, to be honest. Like, there were moments of this book that were very uncomfortable for me. And then eventually, like, this is found out that they're in this relationship and he is prosecuted, and then they're trying to like continue their relationship after he is done serving time. I mean, like, there's really like some interesting gray areas of this that I was surprised more people were not pushing back on in reviews. So I don't know if this is one that I can necessarily recommend. I mean, if it sounds interesting, I mean, you'd be welcome to pick it up, but it was one that I just was kind of like, again, surprised that more people were not finding the main kind of horror romance of this book a little bit more problematic. All right, then I picked up Not Quite Dead Yet by Holly Jackson. And this book has a fun and kind of like a little bit unbelievable premise, which is basically there is a teenage girl who is attacked, and she is attacked in such a way that, and this happens very early in the book, it's like part of the plot that's like on the back of the book, so I'm not giving anything away, but she's attacked in such a way that basically she's going to die in 7 days. And we know for sure this is going to happen, or it's like highly, highly likely that it will happen. And so she's trying to catch the person who attacked her, because this is basically the person who will be her murderer in this period of time. And Holly Jackson is known for A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, which is a trilogy that was made into, I think, a Netflix show. And I really enjoyed that trilogy. I've read multiple things by her at this point. I find her, and these are all kind of like YA, kind of mystery suspense. I find her to be really creative in her plotting, and this was no different. I would say it's not as up there as like the third book in A Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy was my favorite. I wouldn't put it up there with that, but I would put it there as a solid kind of on the same level as like the first book in that series, which was also quite good. Next up, I read Kill for Me, Kill for You by Steve Kavanaugh, and I have been working through a bunch of backlist of Steve Kavanaugh. I've been enjoying a series by him and also several of his standalones. And this is basically kind of a Strangers on a Train plot, which if you're familiar with that film, it's basically two people agreeing to kill someone else for another person because they're not connected directly with that other person, and so it will be harder for them to get caught. And so you have that kind of plot that's like driving the first part of this book. I found this book to be really engaging. I actually was listening to this when I was traveling, and so I was like in a hotel gym, like going for my run, and I was listening to this book, and it was very engaging and I enjoyed it. So I will continue to read Steve Kavanaugh. I just find his stuff really interesting and look forward to continuing to read his backlist. Then I picked up a very short novella-like audiobook called I'm Gonna Get You Back by Elena Armas, and this is something that was released on Spotify, and I wanted to just, I saw it advertised basically and decided to pick it up. And it's basically the story of this writer who goes to a like writer's convention, and she runs into a childhood friend who they have feelings for each other, and she's also being stalked by someone who is not the childhood friend, and he's trying to kind of like protect her from the situation. What I thought was kind of tough about this one is like, because it was so short, nothing was really developed very well. Like it just felt like it was very quick, and like everything that was happening in this particular story, like nothing got developed enough that I could really understand kind of like motivations and things like that. The reveal of the stalker, which happens, toward the end, I was just kind of like, okay, like I just didn't have any connection to like any of the characters. And this particular author, I've read her earlier work, which, for example, one of the books is The Spanish Love Deception. I loved that book. I thought it was so like interesting, and I just really liked it. And then she's got a second series that I've read as well. So this one, again, just was kind of a miss for me. I think part of it was just, it's hard to fit in something meaningful in like a relatively short novella kind of format. And so I didn't really feel like this was a good one for me. All right, then I read a book called Remarkably Bright Creatures about, this is by Shelby Van Pelt. And this is about a number of different characters, but one of them is an octopus. And the octopus has its own kind of like sentience, and it's talking and having feelings and responding to things. And then you have like a number of different characters around it. What I will say is I don't want to go too much into the plot because I think it's just one of those things that you should just experience. Like if this is something that sounds interesting to you, I will say that in general, I've read a couple other books, and actually another one that has an octopus in it, or that has like dogs and other things that are kind of talking. And I find these books to be like charming, but not necessarily a subgenre that I'm seeking out. And I would put this one in that category. I'm glad I read it just because a lot of other people have talked about this one. And I was curious, about it, but not necessarily one that I would seek out again, and not necessarily an author I think that I would necessarily like try to find their other work. Next, I read a book called Nowhere Girl by Carla Ciccone. This is about a woman who is late stage diagnosed with ADHD and is kind of talking about how in general women with ADHD are diagnosed later in life, and like what does that mean for them in terms of their experience and their treatment, and how they have just kind of self-knowledge about this diagnosis. And this book I found interesting. If you've been following for a while, I've read a lot of books recently on neurodivergence and neurodiversity for a project I was doing last year. And so I continue to read in that area. And what I found kind of unique about this book is she is doing more of like a gendered analysis of like what is the experience of women in this space and why is that experience different than people who are male identified. And then she's also talking about kind of her own personal experience alongside that. And I appreciated all of that. I thought it was really interesting. Next, I picked up another short novella called Love and Other Killers by Brynne Weaver. And Brynne Weaver is known for a trilogy, I believe. I think it's a trilogy, which is basically like dark romance about serial killers falling in love with other serial killers. And this is a novella that follows along with the characters from that trilogy, and they are basically having a competition of like, not only are they serial killers falling in love with other serial killers, but the people they are killing is other serial killers. So it's like very meta. And in this particular book, there's some kind of like game or competition where several of them are basically like trying to see who can kill this serial killer that they've identified first. And they're kind of like racing each other. Similar to the one I mentioned earlier, that I'm Gonna Get You Back, I find it, again, kind of challenging in these novellas to have like meaningful interaction because it is so fast and it is so quick. And I think that if you have not read the earlier trilogy, which I think is called like the Ruinous Love trilogy, this would make like no sense. It would not have a lot of meaning. You would not really understand what's going on. So I felt like this was a novella that was really written for the people who've enjoyed this trilogy and who've like wanted more about these characters. And this author also had another series that she recently started, and that book recently came out. So I wondered if this was kind of like an in-between, the two series that she was working on. So I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like blowing me away in terms of what the author was offering here. Okay, next up, I read a book called The Frozen People by Ellie Griffiths. And Ellie Griffiths is known, I think probably most popularly for a series called the Ruth Galloway series, which is a series that is basically about an academic who solves cold cases. And I love that series. I've read every single book in that series. Whenever a new book comes out, I immediately pick it up. And so I thought I need to like work myself into the backlist of Ellie Griffiths because there's several series she's written that I've just not encountered yet. So I read a book last month in one of the other series. And so this is her most recent series that she started. And it is basically about people who are time traveling to solve crimes. And I would say that as a book that is like kicking off a new series, I really like this. I would definitely pick up the second book in the series. It reminded me a little bit of another set of books that is also about people who are time traveling, but they're not necessarily solving crimes. It's more for kind of like historical analysis. And I'm not remembering the name of the first book in that series, but I'll put it in the video so that you can see what I'm talking about. I feel like these are very similar to each other. So if you've read this other series that I can't remember the name of, you would probably like this one as well. And I'm looking forward to picking up whatever's next in that particular series. All right, then as kind of a nod to Halloween and scary books, I picked up a book called Dead of Winter by Darcy Coates. And this is a book that I had heard somebody really be like very complimentary about. And it's not like, I typically do not read super scary books or like horror books. I will read mysteries and I will read like very dark, like psychological mysteries, but I'm typically not going for like horror. And this book is basically about a bunch of people who are going up to like a ski lodge and they get caught in a storm. They have to pull over and they get kind of like trapped in this like cabin that's like in the middle of nowhere. And very slowly someone starts killing them off. So it's a very kind of like traditional trope if you're kind of thinking about this. And if you're familiar with, you know, horror and scary movies and things like that. And this was a perfect fit for Halloween. Like I enjoyed it. I thought it was like interesting. I didn't see the reveal coming. I kind of saw it coming, but it was still fun, you know, the reveal of who the killer was. And I don't know that I would pick up more from this author. This was very much kind of like I'm going to read this because it's Halloween type time of the year. But I did really enjoy that one. I thought it was fun. All right, then I picked up a book called Too Good to Be True by Carola Lovering. And this is a book about a woman who becomes engaged to a man. And then we find out that that man has kind of like a secret family. And so you're hearing perspectives from multiple different characters throughout this book as we're like unveiling like different layers of like what everybody's motivations are. I liked this book. I thought that it got a little bit convoluted, you know, as it went along, but I thought that like the motivations were clear in terms of like, and they made sense, you know, in terms of why everybody was kind of making the choices they were making and like what was happening within this book. Again, like I would say maybe 75% of the way in, it got a little bit convoluted in terms of the plotting. But I thought overall it was pretty interesting and I could recommend that one too. Okay, then I picked up, as kind of like maybe a little bit of a palate cleanser, a graphic novel / comic called Unfamiliar by Haley Newsome. And as you will see from the cover of this book, it is also Halloween themed. It is about a witch. I will say that when I was reading this graphic novel, I felt like it was like every other page was like missing a page because I was like, what is this even about? I was having a hard time following along with the plot and the characters. And it felt like it could have used just a little bit more fleshing out. Now, I say that as someone who does not read a lot of graphic novels, who does not read a lot of comics, but this is one that it was kind of fun just because of like the holiday Halloweenish themes. So I don't know that I would pick up another another graphic novel or another comic in this particular series, but it was fun to just kind of enjoy that as part of a Halloween theme. Next, I picked up a book called Chasing Evil. This is by John Edward, and this is about the true story of a partnership between an FBI agent and a psychic. And what I found really fascinating, and actually I should mention, this is co-written. So it's John Edward and Robert Hilland, which is the FBI agent and the psychic writing this together. And basically what this is about is the FBI agent is a pretty big skeptic of using psychic talent, you know, to solve crimes. And then he has these very personal interactions with this particular psychic who's very well known, and he becomes a believer. And there's several stories and several examples that he utilizes throughout this book to talk about, you know, their relationship and like very specific crimes that the psychic helps him to solve. And I found it really interesting. I appreciated that they kind of wrote this together, and I did listen to this on audio and thought that it was really well done. Next up, I picked up a book called The Killing Plains by Sherry Rankin. And this is basically a pretty traditional mystery about a man who is sentenced for a killing. And then he gets out of prison and another killing happens like right after he gets out of prison. And people are thinking that it's him again because of like a signature of this killing. And there is a detective or a police officer that's like not sure that this is the case. And they're starting to kind of investigate this. And it turns out that indeed this is not the killer. And, you know, there's a whole other like layer of things that are happening here. I would say that this is a book that I don't think this is part of a series. I think this is a standalone. And let me actually look and see if this is part of a series. I might read another book. Yeah, this is a standalone. And this book did win an award for being a debut. This is, I think, the author's first book. And then there's a second book that's coming out in like February of 2026. For a first book and a debut, I thought this book was not bad. I think that I might consider picking up another book by this author just to kind of see where they go with it. It hung together well. I didn't feel like it was like super memorable in terms of some of the other books that I've read. And I read a lot of mystery suspense. So I feel like this was just kind of like middle of the road. But I might see what they did in kind of a next book if they have another one coming out. Next, I read a book called The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy by Bridget Knightley. And I didn't realize that this is another Hermione fanfic book. And I've talked about this before. So if you are familiar with Hermione and Draco fanfic from Harry Potter, this is a version of that. And what I would say is not a lot stands up to the original fanfic that I read, which is called, now it's a new book called Alchemized, which I have not yet read, but I read the original book, which was called Manacled, and was just like head over heels for that book. I thought it was fantastic. And I would say that this has like some interesting creative elements to it. It's basically the Draco character is ill and he's trying to be healed by the Hermione character, and they have kind of like an enemies to lovers situation. Again, this was one of those books where I wasn't really seeing the rationale for why they were attracted to each other. And I saw the rationale for why they were enemies, but not really kind of the transition into the enemies to lovers. Like it didn't make as much sense. And so I think that I would maybe pick up another book by this author, but it would depend a little bit on what it was. And I continue to be kind of like, I don't know, I find it kind of funny, like all of this Hermione fanfic that's like floating around. So the next book I picked up is called People Watching by Hannah Bonham Young. Hannah Bonham Young is a kind of an auto-buy author for me, and I've loved a lot of the different things that she's written. I really like this one as well. It's basically the story of a early 20s female main character who's taking care of her mother, who has Alzheimer's, and her father is also kind of a caretaker for the mother, and they're like trading duties on this. And then this guy comes into town, and he's like a little bit of like a bad boy and an artist, and is not expecting to stay for very long. And they begin to have a relationship. And she is basically interested in a little bit of a distraction, from her life. She feels a little trapped, in terms of the small town that she's living in, but also that she's like made this commitment and choice to her family to be with them as they're kind of like going through, this situation with the mother. And the father is actually kind of trying to get her to fly the nest a little bit, and she's refusing to do it. So there's kind of these interesting elements. I liked the small town. I liked the characters on their own. I liked the family dynamic between the father and the daughter, and eventually between, this guy who develops a relationship with the father as well. And there's also this really lovely connection between the mother, who's a former art teacher, and this man who comes back into town who was her student. And so he has kind of this deep care for her as well. So I really like this one. I thought it was nice. Next, I read a book called Kala by Colin Walsh, and this is basically a book that goes back and forth in time. There's a girl who goes missing, and then it kind of speeds into the future, and there's a group of her peers, basically when they were teenagers, who are working through what happened, and that caused her to disappear. I would say this is a book, I kind of wanted it to be a movie and not a book. Which I rarely say. I typically always like the book better than the film, but this is one that just based on different elements of it, like there's like I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's some elements of this that I thought this would be more cinematic than it would be in novel form. And I don't know that I would read another book by this author just because of like the plotting sometimes was not tight. And it felt like, I don't know, things didn't quite hang together for me on this one. So can't necessarily like fully recommend it, but I think if you like mystery novels that go kind of back and forth in time, this might be one to at least like take a look at and see if you want to give it a read. Then I read Quiet Longing by L.H. Causeway. This is the second book in this series. I read, I think, the first book last month, which was called Quiet Types. And that was the book that was about the maid and the hotel security guard who meet on the bus, and he is mute. And in this particular book, this is about, I think the male main character, I don't think he's the cousin of the mute guy, but he's like friends with the cousin. And this takes place in Ireland. And the girl main character, it comes over as not a foreign exchange student, but she's like visiting family from the United States. And she comes for the summer, and she and the male main character fall in love. And they begin to have a relationship when they are teenagers. Then, for various reasons, they split up. She goes back to the United States. He goes this other direction. She gets married, and then she has an abusive relationship. And then like 15 years later, she's back, and they kind of strike up their relationship again. The male main character does show up in book 1, but the female main character does not. And so you get to kind of further the story of this guy. And I would say that the back and forth between kind of like the first large section of the book is basically the story of them as teenagers. It doesn't go back and forth. It kind of tells that story, and then it like switches to the future and it tells the next story. And I actually really liked that format. I liked the, like seeing their relationship develop, and then kind of like what comes in between them, and then them kind of being reunited was a really powerful way of telling the story. There's a third book in this series that I would absolutely pick up, and probably will pick up soon. Okay, next I read a book called Killing Season by Faye Kellerman. This is another book that I have a hard time describing. It's basically 3 books in one. I don't know how this was released, but it's basically like a combination of 3 different novels. And it is the story of a teenage boy whose sister is killed, and he is trying to find out who killed his sister. And he ends up in a relationship with another teenager, a girl, and she's like helping him to figure this out. But this book was such a weird mishmash of things. And so the genre was confusing. Is it a coming of age? Is it a mystery? Like, what exactly is this? Is it a romance? Because they're kind of having this romance. And the weirdest part about it was there were several parts of the dialogue that felt like the teenagers were like in the 1950s, which the book is like a contemporary book. This is not set in the 1950s. And I was like, this is strange. And part of why it was strange is because I have read this author before. She has a very well-known series, a mystery series, that is basically about a cop and this woman who he eventually marries, who's like an Orthodox Jew. And I love this other series. I find it to be like super smart and interesting, and it has these like really interesting cultural elements because of like the incorporation of the Judaism. And so when I read this, I was like, this feels really almost like it doesn't feel as advanced as what I've seen this author do in this other series. And so I just found it odd. And I think a lot of other people did too. When I read some of the reviews, people were like, this was just a major miss. Like they didn't understand what this was. And it felt like someone was trying to write like in the voice of teenagers, and they'd like never interacted with a teenager before. It was like what they thought teenagers sounded like. So it was strange, and it was distracting as I was going through this. So this is another one that it's like 700 pages, I think, like all combined. And I read it and I was kind of interested to see where it was going to go. But it was also like a little bit of because it was 3 novels basically combined into one, like literally I think it was released as like a part 1, part 2, part 3. That was also confusing of like, why was it released that way? It felt like it could have been edited down. So I was like, was this made into a serial for a particular reason? Like I left this book with a lot of questions. Like, why was this written? Why was this published? It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So that was kind of an odd one. Okay, then I read a book called The Girl in the Fire by Sarah Stevens. And this is a book that does jump back in time between a woman who like in the contemporary, like now part of the novel is about to get married, and she leaves her fiance and just kind of disappears, and he doesn't know why. And then he follows her to try to figure out what's going on. And he gets embroiled in this kind of like past situation of these teenagers that it turns out, like, and I think this is something that's revealed like relatively early in the book, like his person he's going to be married to this is not who she actually is. Like, she's actually this teenager that these events happen to. And she's like changed her identity and has now gotten like sucked back into this other thing that happened when she was a teenager. And I would say this is another book that was very convoluted by the end, in terms of like, you have all these people who are like taking on other identities. And so that's being revealed like throughout different parts of the plot. And it was interesting, but it was also almost like too complicated in terms of what was happening with these characters in the plot. So yeah, it kept me entertained, but I don't know that I would seek out another book by this author. All right, then I read a book called The Elements by John Boyne. And this is a book that was recommended to me by a friend of mine. And he recommended it, his wife had read it and thought it was really interesting. And basically it's a book that's told in 4 parts. And the 4 parts are, I'm gonna look this up to make sure that I know that I'm getting this right. The 4 parts are from the perspective of the enabler, the accomplice, the perpetrator, and the victim. So it's kind of centering around this concept of these identities. These characters are interconnected, but they're not all connected by the same crime. They're all connected. There's like 4 different crimes that are happening in this book, and 3 or 4 different crimes. And they are kind of like loosely connected to each other, but it's not like there's the enabler of the crime, the accomplice of the same crime, the perpetrator of the same crime, and the victim of the same crime. But they're taking on these different identities in like these interconnected narratives. I don't know if that's making any sense. What I will say is I thought this book was incredibly well written. I think John Boyne has a very strong reputation as a writer. However, I had someone I know who's from Ireland, and this is a Irish author, reach out to me, and she was like, she'd seen that I was reading this book, and she was like, do you know about kind of the controversy around John Boyne? And I was like, no, I haven't heard anything about this. And there is a similar controversy around John Boyne to the controversy around J.K. Rowling. And if you are familiar with that controversy, you know that J.K. Rowling has said some very public things that are seen as basically anti the trans community. And John Boyne has basically identified in very similar ways to J.K. Rowling in terms of his feelings about the trans community. And without going into too much detail, because this is very easy for you to find, if you are interested in reading about either of these authors, you know, you can understand their politics and learn where they're coming from with this. But a lot of people have found this to be incredibly problematic for them to take these stances. And I, of course, disappointed by that. You know, when I read that about John Boyne, I do think that I was listening carefully for that because I knew about that before I picked up this book and I read it on audio. And I did not find those politics coming into this particular set of narratives in the way that I was concerned they might. And there are some references to sexuality. There are some references, I think, even to like at least one trans individual in this book. But it wasn't anything that felt overt, and it wasn't anything that I found offensive. That said, you know, some people struggle to disconnect an author from their politics. And so I just feel like it's important to mention that. And if you want to do a deeper dive, you can learn more about this. I would say, you know, if you can set that aside and kind of put a pin in that, this is a very creative way of approaching a book. And I think that John Boyne pulls it off. And I don't think every author could do that in terms of structurally what he is doing in this book. I found it incredibly compelling. You know, each of the narratives on their own. Sometimes when you read books like this that have like 4 different, perspectives, you know, and different characters being focused on, they're not all equally interesting. You know, you find yourself drawn to one more than the other. I found all of these equally interesting, and I actually really liked how he tied everything together at the end of this book. So take that for what you will. I think that if you want to do a deeper dive either on J.K. Rowling or on John Boyne, you could certainly do that. You know, there's plenty of press, you know, that's starting to cover, you know, their public statements around these issues. All right, I read a couple more books in the month of October. One is called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. And this is basically a series of essays on creativity that were just lovely. And I found myself doing some light annotation in this book, like kind of like sticky tabbing, you know, some of the chapters that I found to be especially inspirational. And I would highly recommend this if you find yourself doing creative work, or you consider yourself to be a creative person or a student of creativity, which I consider myself to be a student of creativity. I would definitely recommend this one. I really enjoyed it. And then the last book that I read is called Twisted Games by Anna Huang. This is the second book in her series, which is called Twisted. And I read the first book. The first book was kind of like a mafia romance, and which I had not really read a ton of. And so it had kind of like a dark romantic vibe. This is a book which is so realistic. It's about a princess and her bodyguard. So if that's something that's of interest to you. And I found this to be, as you can tell, a little bit unbelievable. I mean, how many princesses and their bodyguards are having romances? Probably more than I think, but still kind of a rare situation. But I did like the plotting of this. I like the character development. It is connected to book one. And I do assume that I will continue to read the books in this series because I just find them to be kind of fun. So those are all of the books that I read in the month of October. As you can tell, some ones that I really enjoyed, some ones that I found to be a bit of a miss, and also some ones that were really hard to talk about and try to figure out what I thought about them because they were just kind of strange. And there was some controversy built into my reading this month as well. So I would love to hear if you have thoughts on any of these controversies, or if you've read any of these books and what you think. You're welcome to drop a comment below the video. And I hope you'll stick around to see what I want to read in the month of November. Until that video, happy reading.